All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking about why Eddie Goldman is one of the most impactful signings that the Falcons have made this offseason. We'll talk about the 2023 top draft prospects and answer a couple of your listener questions, including talking about where the Falcons roster ranks from a talent perspective.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. It's been a couple of days, guys, since I've had to do that. So I forgot my spiel for a second. But you know, you can we want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Locked On Falcons, of course, free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, you can check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel to get the lowdown on that, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So as you can guess, you know, those Falcons all-time draft series that we ran the first 4 days this week gave me some much needed time off to recharge, but we're back. And of course, we got a big time roster move that, you know, if you've been listening to this podcast for basically the last 2 months, you kind of saw coming. And we'll get into sort of Eddie Goldman signing. We'll talk a little bit about the 2023 draft class. I watched a couple of those guys in my days off, and we'll answer a couple of listener questions. Got a couple of good email questions talking about, you know, maybe some alternative options to Kyle Pitts in last year's draft beyond Justin Fields, as well as sort of conversation about where the Falcons compare with some of the other teams that are considered in the dregs of the NFL. So, talking about Eddie Goldman, you know, obviously the Falcons need a lot more help up front in terms of their pass rush and their run defense. You know, they had the worst pass rush in the NFL last year. They were 29th in DVOA against the run last year as well. And, you know, I've been talking about the Falcons bringing in Eddie Goldman beyond just this summer, but like since 2018. And certainly over the last 6 weeks, you've seen me talk about the Falcons need to get another defensive lineman you know, in that room alongside Grady Jarrett. You know, in addition to Eddie Goldman, we've talked about Akeem Hicks and Larry Ogunjobi, Brandon Williams as well. But often, you know, due to the Ryan Pace connection, you kind of felt like Goldman was probably a pretty good bet. And I think the reason why you like the Goldman signing, or at least the reason why I like the Goldman signing, you guys are more than welcome to provide your feedback on if you agree with me, is like, and this goes back to what I wanted from Eddie Goldman way back in 2018 when he was on my Falcons radar, was he's basically a lot like Dontari Poe, who was a 3-down nose tackle, which is a relative rarity in the NFL. And back then, obviously, with the Falcons letting Poe walk in 2018, I was like, oh, Eddie Goldman's going to be the guy that we replace Dontari Poe with. He wound up re-upping with the Bears. And then, you know, the next 2 seasons in 2020, he sat out the 2020 season due to COVID, and then came back this past year and wasn't particularly good. And the Bears decided, you know what, let's move on from him. And, you know, I think Goldman is certainly an upgrade over what potentially the Falcons had last year, particularly as a pass rusher. That if you imagine a scenario where Eddie Goldman this year in 2022 gets all of the 2021 pass rushing snaps that Jonathan Ballard, Mike Pennell, and Tyler Davison got last year, and all 3 of those players are no longer with the team, you know, that amounts to about 360 snaps. And if you look at Goldman's, you know, pressure rates prior to this most recent year, that would, on that sort of snap count, that would result in about 25 or 26 pressures, which isn't a huge number, but certainly significantly more from what you got from those 3 players in Ballard, Pennell, and Davison last year, which was a combined 11 pressures on that snap count. And then if you look at sort of Goldman's career high pressure rate, on that similar workload, that would be about 35 pressures, which comparatively to Dontari Poe and what he brought to us in 2017 was 40 pressures, but he did it on 531 pass rush snaps. So theoretically, Goldman, at least at his best, has been a much more productive pass rusher than Dontari Poe, and that career high pressure rate was his rookie season. So we haven't quite seen the same dividends with Goldman in recent years, but certainly a guy that could potentially give this team 25, 30 or more pressures this year. And even if he's only producing as a pass rusher at the same rate he did last year, which where he had a career low pressure rate on that same workload, that's still 18 or 19 pressures on a roughly 360 snaps. So even if you're not getting the best of Eddie Goldman, you're still getting better production from him than you got out of essentially three players last year. And then you also couple that with Goldman's potential to improve in the run defense. You go back to 2018 and 2019 at the outset of that new contract that he got. You look at Pro Football Focus's, run stop percentage metric. He was a top 10 run defender in the league in those seasons. So peak Eddie Goldman is a real impactful player. If he can get back to those pre-COVID levels, he can be a real difference maker up front. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about this next week when we get into the D-line breakdown ahead of training camp. But one of the reasons why I was so confident, for the last month or two that the Falcons would be making a move similar to this was just like when you just looked at the current group of D linemen, like you weren't impressed, right? And pardon my hyperbole when I say this, but like if the Falcons had rolled into camp with the current group of players on the interior defensive line, like we would be sitting here, or at least I would be on this podcast talking about criminal negligence on the part of the decision makers in this building. And that's not meant as a offense to Taquan Graham and Marlon Davidson and Anthony Rush and Vincent Taylor, but all those guys have shown for most of their careers and probably will continue to show for the remainder of their careers that they're more back end rotational guys, not guys that at least two of those guys would be starting alongside Grady Jarrett in the Falcons base defense. And then, one of those guys potentially emerging as the running mate on the interior in the nickel, which the Falcons will play the majority of the season. But part of the reason I could sit here rattle off a thousand numbers in metrics to illustrate this point, but basically last year's run defense, and we focus so much on, the other issues of the team, particularly the pass rush, but last year's run defense was one of the worst run defenses the Falcons have had in like 2 decades when you look at certain metrics, right? And like they gave up like 720 rushing yards over the final 4 games of the season. There was 2 games where they gave up over 200 yards rushing. And then there was 1 game where they were 5 yards short of giving up 200 yards rushing. So, it was one of those things for me that like, I looked at it and like, there's no way that you can, even if you look at guys like Ballard and Pinnell and Davidson as not being major contributors, you can't look at this unit that was one of the worst D lines in the league last year, frankly, basically outside of Grady Jarrett, and think that you got better at that position by subtracting those 3 veteran players that are at least relative to the guys that we have currently on the roster are collectively way more proven than the guys we have currently on the roster. So that's part of the reason why, like, for me, like, they had to sign somebody. And I thought Eddie Goldman was as good an option just because he fits, he can be that nose tackle. He can bring juice on passing down, and peak Eddie Goldman, I won't say it's like a top 10 D tackle in the league, but certainly a guy that can be an impactful 3-down defender. And that's something that I don't know if you could say about literally anybody else that was potentially available this offseason. So, I'm big, thumbs up for this move. They get Goldman on a 1-year sort of prove it deal, like so many other players they've signed this offseason, last offseason. We'll find out what the details are when those get, released over the next couple of days or weeks or whatever the case may be. But at least the upside with this Eddie Goldman, not only does it give you value this year, but it potentially gives you long-term value next year because, obviously the Falcons will have potentially cap space to pay guys. They're signing all these guys to these 1-year prove it deals under the idea of like, hey, if you play well for us, someone will pay you. And unlike, the last 2 off seasons outside of Cordero Patterson, that someone has been somebody else. Shout out to Foye Oluokun, but like in Russell Gage and among others. But like now next offseason, that will potentially be the Falcons paying those guys, and Eddie Goldman maybe, near the top of that list. And certainly you want to find out, certainly you're going to need to get a nose tackle soon, because we've talked about this with Troy Anderson. Like, if Troy Anderson is the future at linebacker, like, he's going to need a nose tackle that can keep him clean moving forward. But we can talk about that maybe later this month when we talk about the linebacker group as well as the D-line group. So that will do it for with the Eddie Goldman conversation. We'll see sort of how this move turns out. But I certainly think I would make the case that this is, at least among the veteran signings, with probably Casey Hayward being number one, this is probably the second potential most impactful offseason move that the Falcons have made. And it happened in July as opposed to March and April. So, patience finally pays off. And maybe we'll revisit that statement. Maybe I'll feel a little bit differently about that once we go through all of the position groups on the defensive line. But that'll be something that we'll talk about, or all position groups on the defense. That'll be something we'll talk about next week and over the next couple of weeks. But at least today, we'll be getting into the 2023 draft takes. And answering some listener questions, including where this team's talent level currently ranks. But before we get into that, guys, I want to tell you about the we've all been in situations where money has been a little tight, and those can be especially stressful when you're worried about what your next paycheck is going to be, and that's going to cover some of your bills. And certainly your stress only increases when you have unexpected expenses come up. But for me, a lot of those times those expenses are, I have a pretty old car, and the maintenance on that thing isn't particularly cheap, and it certainly isn't getting cheaper as time wears on. But now Dave can help you or me get out of those stressful situations. And Dave is not a person. It's a banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's no interest. There's no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app, and you can too. So head on over to the App Store, download the Dave app. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. Remember, FDIC. Your future you will thank you. So we're talking about the 2023 draft class. And, I put out a tweet earlier on Tuesday this week, basically, and I'll reiterate that tweet. I said, early 2023 draft opinions. Will Anderson and Jalen Carter are as good as advertised. CJ Stroud and Bryce Young are not. And for those of you out of the loop, Will Anderson is the outside linebacker for Alabama. Jalen Carter is the defensive lineman for Georgia. CJ Stroud is a quarterback for Ohio State, and Bryce Young is a quarterback for Alabama. Now let's talk about Stroud and Young for a second. And I think both guys at this point in time, what I mean by that they're not as good as advertised is I still think they're very early in their development. They still look like guys that have only started in college football for 1 year. And so I feel like, the expectation shouldn't be that they should be beyond that. But I think the sort of the narrative around those guys is kind of like, oh, they're ready to play right now. And I think they're still a little green and still need a lot of development. What's interesting about those two quarterback prospects in particular is like they have a similar sort of dynamic between them, as I think you can make a case between Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder here in Atlanta, where I think Stroud is probably a little bit better suited to be more of an RPO-based quarterback, where with Mariota, you can run probably a little bit more of that stuff, and maybe we'll see a little bit more of that stuff in the Falcons offense this year. And Young is probably a little bit more like Desmond Ridder, which is that sort of traditional drop back, play action quarterback. With Bryce Young, unlike Desmond Ridder, my one concern about him fitting into that style of offense, which is the style of offense I think the Falcons would prefer to play. I do wonder a little bit about Bryce Young's height and whether that is going to make him less effective at attacking the middle of the defense, which is sort of the bread and butter of this Arthur Smith offense. And so we'll see sort of where those two guys are 6 months from now in terms of their development. I think there's certainly areas of their game that they need to improve upon. And I'll also be curious to sort of see if we look back at the Falcons offense for, the stretch of games that Marcus Mariota is a starter, as well as the stretch of games that Desmond Ridder is a starter. And yes, I'm going to assume that we will see both of those guys start this year. It's just, to me, a question of how much we will see of each. And wondering whether or not, which is the sort of type of offense that we should be looking to run. Like, again, my assumption is that Mariota will be probably more effective running the offense when he's on the field than Ridder is. But I do wonder if it clicks a little bit more maybe with Ritter because we're doing more stuff that's in Arthur Smith's wheelhouse. So we'll see about the quarterback development. But my one of probably many spicy takes I'll say on today's episode is that these are not two guys that I'm super enthusiastic about tanking for at this point in time. Although when it comes to Jalen Carter and Will Anderson, it's a completely opposite story. Like, I think those guys are legit NFL players. Like, you could drop them in training camp right now and they'll be ready to go week one. I don't think that would be the case with either Stroud or Young. I think both Jalen Carter and Will Anderson have super high ceilings. They have the potential, and we'll see what happens over the course of the season. And hopefully for their sake, they stay healthy. But I do look at them right now and think they have comparable ability and potential and upside as other sort of elite pass rushers that we've seen over the last we can go back 20 years if you're an old school UGA fan and talk about Richard Seymour. Seymour's a little bit bigger than Jalen Carter, but Carter's more like Seymour I think was like 6'6", 300. Carter I think is listed at like 6'3", 310. I would guess he's probably like 6'3", 300, 295, somewhere in that, just guessing off of his build or whatever, which is more like how Ndamukong Suh was built, was like 6'4", 310. So I feel like Carter has that same type of potential, and we'll see if he lives up to that this season. It's same thing with Will Anderson. I look at him like in the same way that I looked at like Von Miller and Khalil Mack. I see a comparable player in that, and so we'll see how those guys fare this upcoming season. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the 2023 draft, and certainly it gets me a lot more excited if we're talking about tanking. And I know that's not something that's a sensitive subject to those people, as I've said many times on the podcast over the last 6 months. Like, this is the one time where I will, not over the last 6 months, but this is the one time basically since we got rid of Matt Ryan. I was like, this is the one time where you're justified in advocating for tanking, and so this is probably the one season, we'll see, where I will not run away from the tanking conversation like I have done in previous, and be like, oh, that doesn't happen in the NFL, all the things that many of you guys are going to say in the comments. So I won't be that guy. So when it comes to at least the big four, and we'll see how many more guys I watch over the next couple of weeks, I'll probably try to look and see is there an Alden Smith to Will Anderson's, Von Miller? Is there a Gerald McCoy to Jalen Carter's Ndamukong Suh? Because, you don't want to be in the situation where the Falcons are picking 6 and both of those guys are off the board, by the time we get to pick 4. And so you're settling for somebody else. So I'll check out, some of these other prospects, particularly on the defensive line. Maybe check out a few quarterbacks, probably also maybe check out a tackle or two, because that's kind of a dark horse, potential need for the Falcons at the top of next year's draft. But we'll see about that, and we'll obviously be talking a little bit more about these 2023 draft prospects probably when we get closer to the season. Hopefully the Falcons will distract us with competitive football so that we won't be too focused on next year and whatnot. So those are my thoughts on the 2023 top prospects in the draft class. I'm eager to see what you guys think about those guys. If there's some other guys that you think I should check out, always looking for your feedback. But we'll provide the rest of today's answering some of the feedback from some of the email that listeners have come and sent me, including talking about whether or not Micah Parsons is a better player to talk about as an alternative draft pick to Kyle Pitts, as well as are the Falcons in a much better situation from a talent standpoint and from a team standpoint than some other teams around the league. And we'll get into those questions as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I do want to let you know about the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows on the same podcast feed, talking local sports, talking national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zinno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on the same podcast feed on your preferred podcast platform, including on YouTube. And you check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta YouTube channel. You'll also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss this season. And speaking of the Atlanta Braves wins and losses, why not head on over to betonline.net, the number one source for your sports betting needs and info. And it's funny, guys, because like when I do these reads, like for BetOnline that we do a lot, I try to change them up to keep them more topical and like, okay, what's going on in the world of sports? Because oftentimes I'm focused on football, and outside of, baseball or basketball or any of these major sports, I don't really know what's going on. So I'm like, okay, what's going on in sports elsewhere? And I'm like, oh, the Tour de France is going on right now. And I'm like, what is, the BetOnline have odds for that? Of course they have. BetOnline has odds for everything. BetOnline has odds for who's going to be the next Brazilian president, right? And I'm like, just looking at those odds, I'm like 4% smarter on, Brazilian politics. So whether you want to bet on, Lula or Jair Bolsonaro or who's going to win the Tour de France, Major League Baseball, the Braves, UFC, boxing, esports, hockey, Vegas casino games, NFL futures, NBA futures, whatever the case may be, you can bet it on it all. Just head over to the website at betonline.net to check out more of the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So our first question comes from Dallas H. He says, hello, I'm Dallas, big listener of this podcast. I get great information where not much is available in Southern California. I love Kyle Pitts, who doesn't, but I have been wondering, what if we drafted another guy, especially Micah Parsons? He wouldn't really enhance this defense with his all-around talent and monster size. He would have really enhanced this defense. I even might think that pick would have been better in hindsight. What do you think? Shout out to the West Coast listeners. I'm always fascinated by the West Coast listeners and how they interact with this podcast, just because they get the podcast on a different timeline than the East Coast listeners. Because, like the audio version drops at midnight every night, but the West Coast guys get it 9 p.m. East or 9 p.m. Pacific time. And, you're getting the video version of this podcast, potentially around dinner time or whatever case may be. So I'm always eager to get feedback from people listening on the West Coast to see how you guys interact with the podcast. Are you checking out the podcast, around dinner? Are you checking it out before you go to bed? Or are you just waking up in the morning community? So, hit me up via email like Dallas did at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or on Twitter on Locked On Falcons, or leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel if you're out on the West Coast or in a different time zone than the Eastern time, Central. You don't have to send your feedback, but like, out west or Alaska or Hawaii or Japan or wherever, let me know how you guys interact with the podcast. But to answer your question, I think it makes sense to wonder about that. Now, what I will say is, I think you're making an assumption that Micah Parsons would have been as good in Atlanta as he would in Dallas. I don't think it's a bad assumption, but it is an assumption nonetheless, because while I was very high on Micah Parsons, I thought he was the best defensive player in last year's draft class. If you had told me that he would have gotten 13 sacks and 70 pressures as a rookie, I would have been like, you're lying. Like, there's just no fathomable timeline where that would have happened. So like, I say that because like part of me wants to sit here and say, like, I think Parsons' rookie season is kind of like the outlier of all outliers. Like, even if you could time travel back to a year ago and somehow simulate the 2021 season 100 times, I don't know how many of those times he has the same sort of monster production. I'm sure some of the time, but I do wonder if that's like kind of an outlier when it comes to that. But, this sort of hindsight draft analysis conversation often comes up when it comes to the Kyle Pitts pick. And I'm not usually a big fan of having these sort of hindsight, this breakdowns of decisions. I feel like decisions can only be judged off the information you knew at the time. And I think part of the reason why we continue to talk about the Kyle Pitts selection is not, as you say, not because Kyle Pitts isn't a great player, but I think part of it is due to the idea that, how valuable is a pass catcher if you don't have a quarterback situation. And certainly at the time when Matt Ryan seemed like he was going to be the Falcons quarterback for the next 3 to 5 years, the Kyle Pitts pick made a lot more sense. But in the, obviously in the last 3 to 5 months, you're questioning it a little bit, because again, while Kyle Pitts may go on to be a Hall of Fame career, if you don't have a good quarterback, then, how much value does a pass catcher bring? Larry Fitzgerald, Andre Johnson, Calvin Johnson, no one's going to sit here and deny what those guys brought to the table as football players on the football field. But, if they didn't have anybody throwing to it, then it wasn't really resulting in a whole lot of team success in that regard. And I think that's why we continue to have these conversations about Kyle Pitts. I think that's why we're going to have conversations about sort of Drake London in his future. And we'll look back at some of these players, particularly at the top of each of these drafts, and say, was there a better option there? Particularly because so much of a pass catcher's ability is owed to who's throwing him the football, and that's not necessarily true of other positions like a pass rusher like Micah Parsons or a cornerback like Patrick Surtain or an offensive lineman like Penei Sewell. Right, they're not as reliant on having a good quarterback for those guys to be successful at their respective positions. And so, this raises a lot of questions about the past and the the decision making that the team has made. Um, you know, I look at the decision, to draft Kyle Pitts as part of the body of work or the body of evidence that you've heard me discuss quite a bit over the last year, which is that the Falcons kind of didn't really have a plan when they came, the regime, I should say, didn't really have a plan when they came into the building. Now, as I've said before, and will continue to say, I don't think that in itself is horrible because I think every team basically is kind of making it up as they go. It's just we kind of look at it in hindsight retroactively and say, oh, this team actually had a plan when their plan actually works out. Like, and I'll use an example, like look at the '08 Dolphins versus the '08 Falcons, right? And the Falcons and Dolphins both pursue Bill Parcells. He winds up choosing the Dolphins over the Falcons as a general manager. We've wind up hiring Thomas Dimitroff. Bill Parcells brings Tony Sperano to Miami, RIP. The Falcons bring in Mike Smith. We take a quarterback high in our draft, Matt Ryan in first round. They take Chad Henne high in their draft in the second round. We take a left tackle high in our draft, Sam Baker at the end of the first round. They take, Jake Long, a left tackle, number 1 overall in that draft. And essentially, when you look at it from that perspective, like, oh, they had basically the same type of plan, but they obviously got different results, right? And that's really ultimately that matters when it comes to this whole planning conversation. Like that next decade in Miami, they went to the playoffs twice in '08 and 2016, but the Falcons went to the playoffs like 6 times. And I think that gets back to more of why we, sit here and have questions about the Pitts selection. Again, has little to do with Kyle Pitts, but no one is complaining except for me, of course, when the team is winning. And I think that's kind of where like you look at the team's plan and you're like, okay, is this a good plan? And no one's going to ask that question if the team is, winning 10, 11 games every single season. So, I feel like Kyle Pitts will probably have a lot of success moving forward. And I hope that the rest of the team starts to have a lot more success so that, we're not necessarily still revisiting, should we have taken another player a year from now in future Q&A. So we'll see. I hope that answers your question, Dallas. Our last question comes from Jim C. He says, I get the message loud and clear that this is going to be a very rough year for the Falcons. When asked to assess the talent on the Falcons roster, Matt Williamson of the Peacock and Williamson podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, called it a barren wasteland. I've read time and time again that we have the worst defense, offense, and even quarterback in the league. To keep things in context, however, I would rather be a Falcons fan this morning than a Browns fan or a Texans fan or a Bears fan. Each of those teams appear to be dumpster fires. What do you think? So, Jim sent this email back in a couple of weeks ago in June, but notably this week, CBS Sports headquarters put out a tweet that ranked the 32 NFL rosters according to CBS Sports writer Cody Benjamin, and they had the Falcons roster dead last. So clearly Cody and Matt Williamson are of like mind. I don't really agree with that ranking, but what I will say is if you were the type of person that said, last 6 months ago that the Falcons had a bottom 5 roster, and I wasn't one of those people, for the record, then I kind of struggled to see why you would think they're still not a bottom 5 roster. While I like some of the moves that they made, I don't feel like, Casey Hayward and Eddie Goldman and Anthony Firkser, plus a couple of promising rookies, are like putting the Falcons in a completely different tier from a talent standpoint than they were a year ago. But sort of to answer your question, Jim, I certainly think it's fair to believe that the Falcons are in a better situation than some of those teams, right? But I would probably say that, while the Falcons aren't currently a dumpster fire, they may be dumpster fire adjacent. Like there's the hint of smoke in the air and you're trying to look around to see where that smoke is coming from. And maybe it's coming from the dumpster next to you, but it hasn't gone on to like a full on blaze at this point in time. And you look at the Brown situation, which I'm sure you're referring to their whole situation with Deshaun Watson. And I know a lot of Falcons fan like, ooh, we dodged that bullet, but like we didn't really dodge the bullet though. Like the Browns jumped in front and took the bullet for us. We should be sitting here bleeding out, in a way. And sort of that speaks to, I think, some of the flawed processes, while we may have gotten a favorable result, but some of the flawed processes and questionable processes that this regime has undergone over the last year plus, right? And we, just talked about the Kyle Pitts draft selection and whether or not that was a flawed process because you didn't necessarily know if you were committed to your quarterback long term at that point in time. And I say that because like this isn't a particularly profound statement. I'm sure most of you would agree with this, but like you can certainly make an easy argument that the various moves that the Falcons will make over the next 9 months, which is roughly between now and the 2023 draft, will potentially have ramifications for the next 9 or more years. And we just talked about the 08 Dolphins versus the 08 Falcons. And that's a great illustration of that. We've talked before on the podcast about sort of the long-term ripple effects of various roster moves, cutting guys, signing guys, drafting guys, etc. You can look at the Eddie Goldman signing this week that has its origin, in terms of the ripple effects from 2018 when the Falcons let Dontari Poe walk and tried to replace him with Deidre Sinat and Terrell McClain. And they've spent basically the last 4 years trying to find a comparable running mate to Grady Jarrett that Dontari Poe was in that 2017 season. And hopefully, as I just argued earlier on this episode, like I hope and believe that Eddie Goldman could be one of the guys that sort of nips this issue in the bud. But if he doesn't, then we're back to the drawing board next offseason and we draft a player or whoever. And then 3 years from now, if that player doesn't necessarily work out, we'll be sitting there looking at the very end of Grady Jarrett's career where he's potentially on the verge of retirement. And we're like, man, we wasted the last 8 years of Grady Jarrett's career trying to find a decent running mate and we couldn't do it. Or we could simply sit here and be like, hey, those last couple of years of Grady Jarrett's career, he wound up getting a lot more help and was, a lot of the pressure and double teams and all these various things were taken off of him. And so like we look at the Falcons' current situation, they're kind of at a fork in a road, right? One direction, could lead to the next decade being among the best, if not the best in franchise history. And another direction could mean a decade or more of mediocrity. And fandom compels us. And when I say us, I mean y'all, because you guys know I'm a fake fan. Fandom compels us to believe and assume that we're on the right path, that we're going to take the path to success. But I look at that obviously and be like, maybe we're on the right path. I don't know. Time will tell on that. And part of the reason why I am skeptical of, overall is like, none of the people that are making these decisions, none of the people that are guiding us down one of these paths have ever successfully guided other teams down these paths. And so the assumption that these people are experts and know what they're doing is a pretty false assumption, right? And that leads to my skepticism. I think it should lead to most skepticism. Obviously, you guys aren't going to have the same degree of skepticism that I have. But I think to any discerning fan, it's going to lead to at least some skepticism that's going to have that question buzzing in the back of your head, being like, was that the right move? And, if you're that type of fan that has those questions and don't just automatically assume, well, of course they know what they're doing. Yeah. Ryan Pace is the perfect person to bring in a young quarterback and develop him. Yeah, because he did that so successfully in Chicago, as an example. And so, like, if you're the type of fan that thinks that way or has those thoughts from time to time, then this podcast is for you. If you're not that type of fan and you're all in on Terry Fontenot, you're all in on Arthur Smith, then you probably are not a big fan of this podcast and you're probably not a big fan of me, which is fine. It's not meant to be for everyone. But, when we look at this Falcons team, particularly this season, the two main issues that I'm dealing with, and I don't know, Jim, if I'm answering your question or just, going off on my own little tangent here, but like, for me, the two big questions that are going to really do a number to really lead us down the right path where we're talking about is, finding the quarterback and finding out if this coaching staff can maximize talent. Now, on the quarterback, we know that hitting on a quarterback is hard. The hit rate on a quarterback is low. You're more likely to strike out than get a hit, right? Finding competent quarterback play is not that hard in today's NFL, But we've talked about if you have aspirations to play football in January and February, settling for a quote unquote competent quarterback, a middle tier quarterback, a Jimmy Garoppolo, a Nick Foles / Carson Wentz, if you don't necessarily have an elite pass rush with that guy, recent history has told us that you're probably not going to go particularly far past maybe the second round of the playoffs. And again, that's another reason why we can go hashtag shill for Will, hashtag suck harder for Jalen Carter. That's my personal thought process. If we wind up having to settle for one of these middling quarterbacks, which you can maybe argue Mariota and Ritter are probably destined to potentially be, doesn't mean that you can't win with those guys, but they're probably not going to help you, outdo Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes over the next decade. So we'll see how that goes. But, obviously answering that quarterback question is probably the most critical answer that this team is going to provide anytime soon. We've seen it with so many other teams, trying to find replacements for their longtime veteran starter with Matt Ryan here. You look at the Dolphins post Marino, you look at the Bills post Jim Kelly. And what you often found in both of those team situations, and we'll see if the Falcons can avoid this fate, and primarily hitting on the quarterback will, I think, go a long way to avoiding it, is that you see those teams go, 15, 20 years or more between, their great quarterback and their next quarterback. Dolphins are still searching basically 20 plus years later. But, these coaches come in, they bring in their quarterback. If that quarterback hits, then they stay. If they don't, then they're out in 3 years and they're bringing in a brand new quarterback and or coach. Like that's just the way. Like these two things are kind of linked. So if this coaching staff is going to successfully rebuild this team, then they're going to have to hit on the quarterback sometime very shortly. And then the other thing is, I know probably one of my more controversial opinions, at least based off of the feedback I get from some of you guys in the comments, is I don't look at this coaching staff, at least the job they did in 2021, as doing a good job maximizing the talent. I know, again, it's like, Aaron, how can you say that? They won 7 games with, this horrible roster. And I just go like, that's the laziest take that anybody can have. Now, you can certainly make claims that, Dean Pease and the defensive coaching staff was out here doing their best to turn those lemons into lemonade. I don't have, when I critical of the coaching staff, it ain't about the defensive coaches, it's about the offense coaches. Like I will never understand how anybody can sit here and be like, last year's offensive output was actually overachieving given the talent that they have, but we're not going to go too deeply on that point. So the last point, I'll bring up is I think, obviously we'll see if one of the current quarterbacks is the guy this upcoming season. Although again, I'm not necessarily going to hold my breath that, either one of these guys is going to be the long-term solution at that position. So we'll keep an eye out. We'll certainly keep an eye out on CJ Stroud and Bryce Young this fall, as well as probably some other guys. But I do think this season will give us a definitive answer over whether or not this offensive coaching staff can maximize the talent they had, right? Last year, the narrative, or at least, what Arthur Smith was putting out there, he's like, oh, I'm going to adapt my offense to fit the players here. And to be frank, he utterly failed at that. And so now this year he has quote unquote his guys, right? And so if he does not successfully adapt to having his guys this year, and we don't see significantly better offensive play, again, I'm not expecting them to be top 10 or anything like that, but to me, the last year they had no business finishing below top 20. And this year I have similar expectations. So, 16, 18, 20, somewhere in that range, like that to me is success. And if we finish below that, or, 21st, I'm not going to haggle over that, but you know what I'm saying? Like if we're significantly below that, then I'm going to be sitting here saying the same thing I said, I have been saying for the last year. Like, are we a well-coached football team, at least on offense? I don't know. So we'll see how that plays out, guys. That's to me kind of what I'm, waiting to see. That doesn't necessarily, unlike the rest of you guys, I don't get excited by trying to figure out if we have a good coach or not. That doesn't get me excited. If I do get excited about, this upcoming season, it's more about like, hey, are we going to finally get that pass rush? We talked about this with Alan Stirk on the all-time draft series, going back to that 06 draft, or that 06 roster where, we had John Abraham, Patrick Kearney, Rod Coleman, and Grady Jackson. And it was like, oh man, like we were going to have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that maybe we have 3 of those guys already on the roster now that we added Eddie Goldman, and next offseason we can add a 4th, right? Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, whoever that is. So I'm eagerly anticipating that more so than I am anticipating what the Falcons do. But obviously, I'll have you covered here all season long. We'll do the best to make it interesting if the Falcons fail to do it, make it interesting on their own. So we'll just see how it all plays out. But Jim, I hope that gets to your question. Like, I don't have a definitive, I get you. Like, I'd much rather be in the Falcons' current predicament than some of these other teams around the league. And talent be damned wherever you think their talent ranks. Frankly, it doesn't really matter to me, particularly on offense. Like, the talent doesn't matter all that much. But again, we're not going to talk about that. I'm done rambling at the end of today's episode. But yeah, we'll see where the Falcons wind up falling over the next couple of years. I just think right now, as I said, they're at a fork in the road, and we'll sort of see which path they go down. But if we're looking back 5 years from now and be like, oh yeah, man, that was easy and they did a great job, we could see that happening. Or we could look at the situation 5 years from like, man, they really messed this thing up, and now we're the post Chad Henne Dolphins trying to make it work with Ryan Tannehill or whatever the case may be. I don't know. Anyway, so I just popped in my head. There was a listener that tweeted me that basically say start a new drinking game whenever Aaron says whatever the case may be. And I was at the time I was just like, I don't say that all that much. And then I just probably said it like 15 times in the last 20 minutes. So now I'm hyper aware of whenever I say that. So if you want to have a fun drinking game, then check out Locked On Falcons and take a drink every time I say whatever the case may be. So you're probably couple of shots deep off today's episode alone. So we'll see what we could do next week when we get into the positional previews, talking D-line. If you want to send in your questions for future Q&As, which we'll have some opportunities to get into probably later in the month, you of course can hit me up via Twitter on Locked On Falcons or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Come up with some other fun drinking games that where don't do it when I say like or that would kill somebody within the first 5 minutes of the podcast. But if you have some other drinking games that you like to play over oft used phrases, every time I bring up a fullback drink or whatever the case may be, always ample feedback here on the podcast for fun ways to engage with the podcast. And if you're a West Coaster that's looking for a fun drinking game, then by all means, send me that email or whatever the case may be. I did it again. All right, guys, I'm done talking. I'm done talking. All right, I'm done. All right, see you guys later.